Gary, I first got to know as the director of Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, KIPCOR. He is now retired. He is the director emeritus of KIPCOR at Bethel College in North Newton. He's an attorney with advanced training in conflict resolution from George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. He is an approved mediator and mediation trainer by the Kansas Supreme Court in areas of core, civil, and domestic mediation. In addition to many workshops and shorter trainings, he has taught college courses in interpersonal conflict resolution, negotiation, culture and conflict, causes of social violence, international conflict resolution, organizational and public conflict, and restorative justice. His current interests focus on public and environmental and organizational, including congregational, we don't fight here, but other congregations probably, conflict and decision-making process. Well, we do make decisions, I guess. With a special focus on consensus-building strategies. While he was the director at KIPCOR, Gary led a team presenting workshops and advanced trainings on restorative practices in schools as an alternative to punitive discipline. We worked a little bit on ACEs. We had our school teachers talk to us about adverse childhood experiences and how they're trying to deal with those, integrate that into how they deal with school discipline or school interaction. So this might fit into today's topic too, I don't know. This program was initiated by the Kansas State Department of Education. Gary has served 6 years on the Kansas Supreme Court Advisory Council on Dispute and Resolution, and he is currently on the advisory board of the Institute for Civil Discourse and Democracy at K-State University. In addition, he is on the national roster of environmental conflict resolution and consensus building professionals for the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution, an organization created by Congress in 1998 and operating under the aegis of the Morris K. Udall Foundation in Tucson, Arizona. Gary and his wife Ann, and Ann is here as well, so we welcome Ann as well, are parents of 3 adult children and 7 grandchildren. They live in McPherson, Kansas, and are members of the McPherson Church of the Brethren. Is that correct? Yes. And are in the process of building a house, and that's neat. Let's open with prayer and then welcome Gary forward. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are a God of love and a God of peace, and that you are a God that sends us into even the most difficult situations. Open today our eyes and our ears and our souls and our minds. Open Gary's mouth to speak, and then give us the tools, give us the Holy Spirit to work, to address, to join, to affiliate in ways that you call us to. Be with Gary as he speaks. We pray this in the name of Christ. Amen. Let's welcome Gary forward to speak.
Technology is not my strength, so we'll see if we can figure this out. Is my mic on? Can people hear me okay? My voice does not carry well. Some people have voices that carry well. I'm not one of those. So if I sort of die down a little bit and you can't hear me, you can either thank somebody for that or you can raise your hand and say, turn the mic up a little bit. What Wilmer went through and read a little bit about my background didn't say anything about prisons, and you might say, well, what's his interest in that? And people in prisons and education. I started out right after I got out of college as an English teacher at Galva High School. And then went in and practiced law, and for a number of years was a prosecutor, and as some of my partners were county attorney, I continued to do juvenile work for another decade with both the juvenile criminal offenses and also the child in need of care cases. And I have 3 children, all involved in public education, including one who's a school counselor. So I get that information in, and it just seemed to me that this was an area that needed a lot of conversation. So how do we begin? There's a huge, huge amount of information on schools and what gets people into prisons and some of this pipeline information. Harvard University Law School has a program. Georgetown Law School and State University of New York both have extensive law review articles. on this, trying to track, and it's hard, it's a very complex issue. It's not as easy as simply saying this is what happens and this is where people go. And it's hard to get a handle on this. So what I'm doing today is not going to be comprehensive. It's not going to be the total big picture. It is going to be data-driven, and I think this is important. If you wonder whether I like charts and graphs, you're going to have an answer to that pretty quickly, because all of this will be charts and graphs. But I think it's important that we look at data and we look at evidence rather than simply saying, well, I think this happens or I think that happens. We still have to draw conclusions from that information, and it's not always clear. I clearly, obviously, have some bias in this in terms of where I think things are going. Other people may interpret things differently, and that's okay. I think that conversation is good as long as we can use the facts and evidence underlying that we draw conclusions from. So what I hope we do is to have some thinking stimulated, not to present something that's gospel, but to try to stimulate thinking and have you start asking questions, even of each other after this is over. What did that mean? Well, what can we draw from the information that's here, and how do we try to interpret that? Maybe answering the so what question. I told my students, I think in every class I taught at Bethel and taught at McPherson College before that, the most important question I can ask is so what? And if we don't have an answer to that, they've wasted an awful lot of time and money, and I've wasted a lot of time teaching the class. And so hopefully we can think critically, and I encourage you to think critically about what's being presented as well. A little bit of a caveat. A lot of what I put up here, much of it will be fairly negative with the prison system. There are some positive things happening. Kansas in 2017 passed Senate Bill 367 related to juvenile justice. I think that's not moving as quickly as people hoped it would, but that's state government. But I think there's some real progress being made, at least in terms of juvenile activities and juvenile justice system, and I don't want to lose that. Also, a lot of the information is not 2018 information that I present. When we talk about national demographics and populations, they draw on the last census, which was 2010. And so some of the information is not of this year, but I think the patterns are there. And some of these are long-term, going back generations. The patterns are there, so I think that's still legitimate. A little bit about the format, and I can try to watch the clock. The clock is set where Wilmer can see how long he's preaching. You can't see how long he's preaching. I guess you can look at your watch. If we just go through what I have, it'll take probably about 25 or 30 minutes. That leaves a little additional time. And I would suggest that maybe if you have questions or comments, just wave your hand as we go through and not necessarily wait until the end. If it looks like we are running a little short on time, then I'll ask people to hold up until the end for questions. It doesn't mean that what you have to say isn't important. It simply means we're trying to get through the material. So what we're going to try to do today, this morning, is to start with some data about prisons and prison rates. Okay, this one is not on. That's okay. I can look over here. I may block some people's vision here. Context matters. And so I want to present quite a bit of information just about prison populations and how this impacts the issue of looking to schools being a pipeline for this. Then look at the connection between education levels and incarceration. Does it matter where the kids stay in school? This is one of those so what questions. How do we connect the dots? We'll spend some time on suspensions and expulsions, why they occur, are they fair, are there alternatives? And then throughout this conversation, we'll be talking a good bit about race. We cannot talk about prison issues and incarceration issues without talking about race. I just don't think that's possible to do. We won't spend as much time on people with disabilities. Are there any SPED teachers, special education teachers here? As we look at the way people in schools are treated with expulsions, we'll get to some of this later, the biggest disparities come with people from racial minorities and also kids that have disabilities. So we'll be talking mostly about the race issue. I don't want to lose track of the disability question. And then we'll do some questions if we have time and conversations and get input from you. Now this next slide is the one that has the smallest print, I think, of anything I'm doing. If you can see the colors, you're okay, okay? So this has to do with general populations, and these are all the local jails, federal, that we have. State prisons, and this is nationally, about 1.3 million people in state prisons. Federal, much less than that. And most of the people, about half in federal, are for drug offenses. Local jails, 646,000, over half of which have not been convicted of a crime, but are there with pretrial because they can't make bail. And if you've been watching the news, there's a lot of conversation right now about bail and how people who are in poverty or are not wealthy basically end up staying in jail because wealthy people can pay bail and get out and poor people can't. So of the 646,000, 450,000 of those have not been convicted that are in local jails, but have not been able to make bail. And then that little wedge of purple and green is blown up on the right, and those are the juveniles that we have. And so as we look at those, we have the technical violations up at the top. Some of those would be status parole. Not a lot of those are drug. About 13,000 relate to people, 8,000 property. The green is territorial prisons, and the gray is immigration and detention at 33,000, and I suspect that these numbers would be higher if we did that today instead of a couple of years ago when this data was here. So that's just sort of an overview of the whole picture of who we have in prison. The growth of incarceration, you can see what's happened, and these are the number of people per 100,000 since 1880. So we see a long trend of it being fairly level, and between 70 and 80, there was a huge jump and it increased. Anybody want to speculate why that jump is there? What happened? Yes. War on drugs, the war on drugs. And we saw President Nixon. There's even been some recent writing that said it was pretty intentional as a way to divert attention from other things, was talking about a war on drugs. When Reagan was elected, it was to just say no. And so what happened is that instead of treating drug issues as a mental health issue, it became a criminal issue primarily, and you can see what happened to incarceration rates nationally. And these are national numbers here. If we look at countries with incarceration rates, and this is again per 100,000 population, the US is at 716, and there are a couple of, North Korea and China are not in here. There's no way to get data on those countries. These are primarily developed countries, not underdeveloped countries. So we look primarily at European and other. 716 in the US, these are both men and women. The next highest is the UK at 147. And from the data we have, again, not knowing about places like North Korea and China, the US imprisons far, far more people per population percentage-wise than any other country in the world. If we look at women, it's even more striking, and the rate at which women are being incarcerated in the US has been growing faster, actually, than the rate at which men have been incarcerated. 127 per 100,000. Portugal is the next with 16 per 100,000. And again, it's a lot of this has to do with how we interpret drug use and whether that's a mental health issue or whether that's a criminal issue. And so we see a lot of incarceration. Well, what about Kansas? We can see the jump in the 70s and the early 80s. It's not quite as striking as a national jump. And then it's leveled off at about 300. That's a little bit lower than the national average in terms of number of people incarcerated in Kansas. And if we look again at where they are in Kansas, I'm running through this. If you have comments or questions, just shout out or raise your hand. And Wilmer even has a microphone, waiting to see some of you say, I got something to say. Okay? So don't hesitate to do that. It's important that we look at numbers and look at data critically. Okay? We need to be asking questions and not saying this is simply the way it is. This is the underlying data that's there. But the conclusions we draw on that as to how we act as a society, how we respond as faith communities, those are conversations we need to be having with each other. Okay, so in Kansas, state prisoners, 9,700. I think last year I was looking at the Department of Corrections annual report for 2017, and I think it was a little over 9,800 last year. These are adult prisoners, and we would have to add the juveniles to that. When we add the juveniles, it's between 10 and 11,000. Local jails, 6,200, youth, 880, and the 880 are not just in prison, but and these are not sink cases, children in need of care, where they have been abused or neglected, but these are kids that may not be sent to a prison, but are still in a facility that is controlled, like a group home that's still a lockup, but there aren't bars. So there are 880, and in federal prisons there are 1,700 in Kansas, and that would be up at Leavenworth with federal prisons in Kansas. So those are the folks in Kansas. This is interesting, and I don't know quite where these numbers come from, but from 2008 to 2013, and this is from the Pew Charitable Trust, which does a lot of research data, not only on prisons but other things as well. Crime rate decreased in those years from 13%, and only 2 states in the country showed an increase in that time period. Historically, in the last decade, crime rates have been decreasing despite of what you may hear from some folks. Imprisonment rate in Kansas increased 7%. That was the 3rd highest imprisonment increase in the country. Only West Virginia and Arkansas were higher. And I don't know what to make of this, but I simply thought that's interesting that as we see crime rates decreasing, it may also have to do with length of sentences and some other things, so I'm not sure we can draw too much in the way of conclusions from this. I just thought it was somewhat striking that Kansas was sticking out in ways that I wish Kansas weren't sticking out when you look at the numbers. Okay, I want to move a little bit to the issue. That's sort of what we've gone through is the background in the context of prisons, who's in prisons, you know, how are they grouped and so forth. I want to look a little bit at the race issue because I think it's important. If we look at the information that's here, and this is based on our last census, which is 2010, because that's where we have the numbers of people that are available, the total of the U.S. population is the left column up and down. The percentage of the incarcerated population is the middle column up and down, and then the rate of incarceration per 100,000 is the far right column. If you look, for example, the white population, non-Hispanic in the U.S. is 64%. That represents 39% of the incarcerated population and 450 per 100,000. Hispanic, 16%. It would be higher now, I'm sure. It's 19% of the incarcerated population, 831 per 100,000. And black is 13% of the national population, 40% of the incarcerated population, with 2,306 per 100,000. So the rates in terms of percentage of people incarcerated is far, far higher for African Americans. If we look at Kansas data, and again, this is based on 2010 census, it's the last census data we have, we would show that the number of people incarcerated per 100,000 with white, Hispanic, and black, and it's even higher in Kansas than the national levels in terms of the numbers of people per 100,000 that are incarcerated. Those are striking disparities. I think there are lots of ways that can be interpreted, and I'm not trying to set out an interpretation here. I'm just saying that it's there, and it's easy to understand some of the frustration in communities that have high rates of incarceration when they see numbers like this and see that in their own communities. This is another way to look at the racial disparities in Kansas prisons in terms of the population, the total population and the people, the prison population. You can see the white drops down, the African American rises significantly. Latino and Native American also rise, but not as much. Actually, Native American doubles, but it's the total population is so low that you don't see that too much. University of Utah did a study just last year where there are many more Native Americans percentage-wise than there are in Kansas, and they were finding that the rate of incarceration for Native Americans in Utah was between 5 and 6 times that of the white population in Utah. A couple of, and these are sort of outliers, they don't have to do with the race or other kinds of things, but when we talk about the impacts of prison, we say, why does it matter whether people are in prison or not? There are some other ways, maybe collateral damage, I don't know how to put it other than that, of people who have been incarcerated, and I thought I would at least add these. This is not a real clear slide, but what about the children who have fathers who are incarcerated? And this is only fathers, not mothers. The rate of women incarcerated is much lower, but that's growing and may be a more significant problem in the future. What about the kids who go to school and try to survive when their dad's in prison, and what sort of impact does that have with how other kids relate to them at school, with how they feel about themselves, with how, as we see family patterns repeating themselves, whether it becomes a norm to have a family member in prison, and so maybe a kid grows up thinking, well, that's just the way it is. Because I think if we, and I don't have data on this, but I think there are some generational kinds of things when we talk about cultural patterns that's there. So when we look, and this is again based on race, the red line are black, and this is not at any one time, this is throughout the, as I understand this graph, it's throughout a child's school years, or the times a child would be at, that almost 1 in 10 black children at some point during their young years would have a father in prison. The percentage for Hispanic is the yellow dots, that's 3.5%, and for whites, it's 1.2. So you can see that disparity in terms of children that have a parent in prison. And then if we look at the homeless, and this just came out from Prison Policy Institute this past week, and I added this because I thought it was interesting. That dotted white line at the bottom is the general public. And this, again, is the numbers per 100,000. Is that right? This is for 10,000, I think. For 10,000, not 100,000 people. And so there would be 21 in the general population per 10,000 that would be homeless. And so, but then we see the far left bar, all formerly incarcerated, it jumps from 21 to about 200 per 10,000. The next one is the women and men. It's higher for women homeless who have been incarcerated than it is for men. Then we have the race, the black, Hispanic, and the white. The blue lines are the age, 45 or older, so the older people tend to be, older being 45 and older. For me, that doesn't seem so old anymore, but they tend to have a higher homeless rate. The prior history, the highest one if they've been incarcerated more than once, the orange bars. And then finally, the length of incarceration, less than time since incarceration if they've been out for less than 2 years is the left red bar. But what you can see is that the homeless population, that's very different if you've been incarcerated. And there are a lot of factors relating to this in terms of where you can find work, what that work pays, whether you can find good paying jobs. And what I don't have data on, but I think we shouldn't ignore, is the overlap between mental illness of people who are homeless and people who are incarcerated. I was looking at the KDOC, Kansas Department of Corrections, fiscal year 17 annual report last night, and they have a whole section on the number and percentage of adult and juvenile people incarcerated who are mentally ill. And so there would be a significant overlap, I think, between homelessness rates and people who are mentally ill. And I don't know how those dots would connect it or how that could be interpreted. I'm simply saying I think that there is that overlap. So when we see that people are incarcerated, we see it affects families. It's not just the people who are there. It affects families, the children. It affects homelessness once they get out. And then what does it cost Kansas? And this is from last year's fiscal report from KDOC. Total incarceration under Department of Corrections jurisdiction was a little over 10,000. The annual budget, and I did this wrong, I think. I was adding up numbers, but the $409 million includes community corrections. It includes some other things that really aren't impacted with incarceration, and so that number should be lower. The average cost per adult inmate is accurate of incarceration, a little under $25,000, and Hutch is right at that level. I think Winfield may be the lowest because it's a lower, I know Winfield's the lowest because the annual report had each facility categorized separately. A little under 25,000, but if you look at the cost for juveniles, at the juvenile correctional complex, almost $100,000 per year. And if you look at the kids at Larned, and there were only 25 at Larned, it's a small number, but it's a $5 million budget. It was less than, it's almost $200,000 per kid to be at Larned per year. And so this becomes a taxpayer issue as well, and I think this is one of the reasons that Senate Bill 367 was passed and there was good bipartisan support. There were a lot of people saying kids should not be incarcerated, should not be turned over to the criminal justice system. And there were also people that were saying, well, but it costs too much. And so when those two ideas came together, that helped get Senate Bill 367 passed. Just for comparison purposes, I thought we'd see what it costs to go to KU. These are for in-state students, not out-of-state. So we have tuition and fees, room and board, books, supplies, other expenses. And it costs about $1,000 more to go to KU than it does for an adult to be incarcerated at Hutch per year. And I wanted to put this in. This has to do with Senate Bill 367 in terms of juvenile justice reform. And this is done by the Pew Charitable Trust just this past year. The lighter blue line are projections. And you can see that there have been drops anyway in the number of juveniles incarcerated, and that's been good since the early 70s. Since 2010, when the numbers were up close to 1,200, and then dropping down to actual numbers. I think the last chart we showed was 880, which was probably a 76 or so. It was down to 723. And without Senate Bill 367, it would have dropped in another 5 years down to a little over 600. They're projecting there's going to be a 60% reduction of that, and it will drop down to about 250. In other words, they're finding ways to handle juveniles rather than simply putting them into incarceration. And as we look at the impact, and one of the reasons I had the context of prisons was, you know, it's that why does it matter whether people are in prison for a while? Don't they learn their lesson? There's some collateral kinds of things when you get people into the system that have a really negative effect long-term, not only for those people, but for their families, and from my perspective, for society as well. Not everybody would have that same perspective that I do. So you can see that there is progress in Kansas, particularly with juveniles and the juvenile justice reform. Okay, where does education fit in? And I don't know whether you can read these numbers, but I can show you. Does this have a pointer on it?
Yeah, the trigger on
the little star thing?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, I was going to hit a button and wipe everything out. I knew that. So, okay, if we look at this, the top one across is 18 to 64-year-olds. And that's generally a working age of the total population. These are national figures that are here, and we see of that age, 1.1 or 1 in 87 white are in prison, 8% or 1 in 12 of African Americans are in prison, and 2.7 of Hispanics or 1 in 36. The bottom two lines across have to do with 20 to 34-year-olds, which is the younger working age population. The Pew Charitable Trust put the numbers together, and they thought that was a way to look at the young adult population. And the middle column across are the total number of 20 to 34-year-olds. The bottom line are the 20 to 34-year-olds without a high school degree or a GED. Okay? Without a high school degree or a GED. We look at let's take the whites, and this is where the biggest jump is. 1 in 57 20 to 34-year-olds would be incarcerated. If there is no high school diploma or GED, it jumps to 1 in 8. If we look at the African American population, it goes from 1 in 9 to 1 in 3. And there are many different studies and surveys and data showing that if you have an African American kid who has been kicked out or dropped out, either one, of high school and does not have a GED or a high school diploma, the rate of incarceration is just a strong, astronomically high. And then we look at all the collateral effects of that in terms of what happens. And then with the Hispanic on the right, it goes from 3.7% to 7% from the total population to those without. So we can see that, and I want to point out that this information doesn't show a cause and effect. It doesn't mean if you don't graduate from high school, therefore, because of that, you will be incarcerated. It's a correlation, which means that the numbers are there, but it doesn't show that one causes the other. And I want to be real clear about that. As we talk about the data, it's showing correlations and patterns, but it doesn't show a cause and effect. There may be some cause and effect there. It may not be the total reason for this. It may be some of the reason, and we don't know how much, but I want to be real clear with that I'm not saying because people drop out of high school or are kicked out of high school or suspended, therefore, because of that, they end up in prison, because that's just not true. Are there questions on this before we move on? Because this really is, yes. Get to watch Wilma run, too.
When you was talking about that, the detention of the kids, I won't say kids, anybody below 18, do they, detention centers, halfway houses, or what? How about Oxford houses and halfway houses?
There are a couple different numbers we've had up here. The total number of youth incarcerated in a, quote, prison setting, I'd have to go back and look, is about 300. There are other settings that you're talking about that would put the total rate between 800 and 900 in Kansas. And those are really, you know, whether it's a prison or not, it's not just a group home. There are, it may be a prison without bars. I'm not sure how to interpret that, and I'm not sure that answers your question, but it would include others as well. Yeah.
Okay, how about the detention when they age out, over 21?
When they age out, typically a juvenile criminal matter is not a criminal matter, but a civil matter. Legally, it's considered a civil matter, and the courts lose jurisdiction of kids when they become adults, which is why in some serious crimes you see a prosecutor move to have the kids treated as adults, which means the courts can keep jurisdiction longer and they can get longer sentences. There are two different things. We're talking about aging out of the system on the juvenile if there are criminal kinds of offenses and the court simply loses jurisdiction at a certain age. I think, and I'm real fuzzy, I'm talking about something I don't know a lot, but wasn't there a fire in Hutch that a juvenile set and some of his family was killed? And I don't remember, I think he was not moved to be treated as an adult. Does anybody remember? And I think the courts were thinking that when he hit a certain age, they would lose he would age out and they would lose jurisdiction. Typically, when we talk about the term aging out, we talk about children in need of care or foster care kids. And they age out at 18. That's a whole nother issue, but a whole nother set of problems when kids age out of the foster care system at 18 and are basically on their own without parental support.
Okay, another question. The mental aspect of drugs or the criminal aspect, are they real interlocking, or is there quite a separation there between people that criminally use drugs and the mentally use drugs?
I don't have an answer to that. I don't know. And my guess is the answer would be pretty complex to that, with a lot of intertwining. So many of the things we talk about, even what I'm talking about, the graphs present it sort of like this is what it is. There are so many nuances and so many gray areas that it's a very complex area to try to come up with good information. But those are important things to talk about in terms of the drug use. When we talk about mentally ill, I don't think, as KDOC and their annual report had information on mentally ill, I do not think KDOC considers drug addiction per se to be a mental illness. I could be wrong on that, but I don't think they consider that to be a mental illness. Is that a sign? Okay. All right. Another look at education. This is the same information. The dotted lines are the total population, and the solid lines are the rate of incarceration. Red is African American. The blue are whites. The green is Hispanic, and you can see the difference between rate of incarcerations if people get out of high school or not. I mean, again, it's not the cause and effect, the correlation, and how you interpret that. What the cause and effect is, the fact is that if kids do not have a high school degree or a GED, the rate at which they're incarcerated skyrockets. A little bit of information just in Texas, and I'll go through some of this pretty quickly. In terms of the third of the kids, this is not in 1 year, this is before they graduate. A third will not graduate. Alternative education programs have a much higher dropout rate. 1 in 3 juveniles in the youth commissioner dropouts, and 80% of the Texas inmates are high school dropouts or have been kicked out. Again, that's in Texas, and this is with Texas Appleseed. Kansas has a Kansas Appleseed program out of Topeka. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's really a good program. And they work not only with juvenile justice issues, but also with hunger issues with kids, and it's just a really good program. I want to spend a little time on this because just the time KIPCOR was starting to do its restorative justice program with schools, this study came out, and we were starting in 2011. This came out in 2011. And KIPCOR has trained something over 1,000 teachers and administrators in restorative justice in Kansas up to this point, and are still having schools ask for that. But this study in Texas was done by Texas A&M University and the State Council of Governments, Council of State Governments. And what was interesting is that they didn't use a sample of students. They tried to track every student in Texas, starting with 7th graders, and track them through high school. And so they started out, and they did this for 3 years, for 3 different cohort years, and that's over 1 million kids. So when we talk about research of using a sample of 100 or a sample of 500 or a big sample of 1,500, here we had between 900,000 and 1 million kids. Obviously, the sample didn't stay the same because some kids would move, some kids would die, all kinds of things happened. But it's such a large number that the information is very valid. It has a lot of legitimacy. And they followed them for a 6-year period. And there are several conclusions that came from this. And this study was not pitching any alternative. They were simply saying, these are the facts related to dropout. And these are the conclusions we draw. They don't say what we ought to do about it. They simply say, this is what it is. Several conclusions. One, suspensions and expulsions are common. It is not unusual. And most disciplinary actions recur at the discretion of school officials. This is the most striking information I've seen in any study that was done. Of the kids suspended, only 3% of disciplinary actions were mandated by state law. That is not a typo. Things like bringing a weapon on campus or selling drugs. 97% were discretionary with the school district or the principal or the school. When we talk about expulsions and suspensions, 97. Now, to be fair, I think we would say, looking at these 97s, every school would say those kids should be suspended. But when we start talking about discretionary action, this is where we begin to look at the issues of kids who are disabled, kids who get a reputation in school of being troublemakers, kids who are racial minorities. The other conclusion, students who are suspended or expelled are more likely to repeat a grade, and school discipline increases exposure to the juvenile justice system. When they're kicked out or drop out of school, the rate at which they hit the juvenile justice system increases significantly. We've seen that with the education rates and who's in prison, and we see that go up. Yeah, question?
Dorothy and I have been part of NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, and one of the things that we found out was that in families, particularly in the minority groups, Hispanic and African American, it is very difficult for them to come to the point of wanting help for mentally impaired students. And the other thing is that we came into contact with a Hispanic counselor in Hutchinson, which is really rare, but she has spent a lot of time in schools and trying to work at the problem from the educational system. In other words, it's almost like trying to bypass the bias of the family to try to head off some of the mental illness problems that relate to some of the numbers that you're putting up there. And so it has not only to do with the socioeconomic problems, but it also has to do with some of the discipline, or pardon me, some of the thoughts of minority people.
Right.
And, you know, how can we get at working at adult family members to sort of change that attitude so we can get these younger kids into a program?
Culture plays a huge, huge role. You're absolutely right that culture plays a big role in that. Do one more question, then I'm looking at the clock. Are we supposed to be done in 3 minutes?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
In this data set, you talked about Texas. What's Texas graduation rate, and what percent or of kids who don't graduate are kicked out of school compared to dropout? And is there a difference between those who end up in prison?
I don't have that data specifically. We know the difference in total prison populations, whether kids have graduated or not. I don't know Texas, and I don't know on these numbers how that would fit out. I do want to look at this because this is a follow-up on the mandatory and the discretionary. Since there were so many kids involved, they could take different schools, and what they found out is for the mandatory suspensions and expulsions, those pretty much tracked the percentages of different groups in the school. For example, if a school had 20% African American, 35% Hispanic, and 45% white, for the mandatory suspensions and expulsions, the ones that were not discretionary, they would find they would track almost exactly with those numbers: 25% black, 35% Hispanic, 40% white, whatever. In other words, they tracked. But for the discretionary violations, what the study found is that they were alarmingly disproportionate in terms of racial minorities and in terms of students who had disabilities. And so that's pretty striking when you say if there isn't a choice, if there isn't discretionary choice, the African American kids and the kids with disabilities and Hispanic kids are not suspended at a higher rate than white kids based on the percentage of population. But when you look at the discretionary suspensions and expulsions, then the study said it was alarmingly disproportionate. That's something that should make us sit up and take notice. This simply, and I'm going to pass over this, is another graph showing the difference in expulsions based on race. Go back, this is the same chart we had before. Does it make more sense now in terms of connecting the dots of the kids who are incarcerated, the people who are incarcerated in education levels, and why it's so important that however we do it, that we keep kids in school. That we keep kids in school. And whether they drop out on their own, maybe because there's a history of suspensions, or maybe because they don't get along with teachers, maybe because they're bullied, whatever those reasons are. Maybe it's just hard for them, grade-wise, but we need to find ways to keep them in school. Does this affect other kids? This is something that comes up a lot. And I think especially as teachers need to be teaching for tests. And so the question is, and I've got a son who's a 4th grade teacher, a daughter who has been a public school teacher but is a stay-at-home mom right now, and another daughter who's a school counselor, and so I get all this feedback from people in public schools, and they say, well, but if we've got a kid over here that's really causing problems, we need to kick him out in order that the other kids can have a good learning environment. You don't hear that as much from teachers as you do from other people. So this was something that was done by the American Sociological Association a few years ago, who were looking at this specific question, and there aren't any studies specifically answering that. But what they're suggesting is that in non-suspended students in schools with elevated levels of discipline will suffer academic declines through the collateral consequence of a punitive environment. We're talking about climate of schools. We're talking about the climate of schools. Do kids want to go there? Does it feel like a community? And there's some other good data that I don't have here. The kids stay in school because they feel like they matter. They feel like somebody cares about them. And so what they are suggesting with this is that excessive use of exclusionary discipline, that's their term, kicking kids out of school, creates a culture of control that impedes the success of all students. This is an assumption on those researchers' part. There is not data to back, there's not data on any of this. But what they're saying is, don't worry too much about this in terms of trying to keep kids in school. It's not going to hurt the other kids because you're changing the climate of the school, where people know that when kids come to school, they matter. And we want to try to take care of you. Okay, quickly, zero tolerance basically says that it's creating more damage than it's helpful. Restorative practices, I'm going to skip over some of this. New York is doing some things. Denver is doing some things. And then the question is, why do administrators suspend kids? It's not because they like it. We don't know what else to do. This is where I would put my pitch in for KIP Corps' restorative justice program. A number of schools that are doing that, and the data, Wichita West is the closest one. They've been working on restorative justice for 6 years. The data is astoundingly good in terms of students. And finally, public policy doesn't make it easier. That's not just in Kansas, that's other places as well. I'm over time a little bit, so I don't know whether you're saying good or we're done. Questions? Maybe not questions now. We're past time. So, and Ann and I are staying for church. We'll be around after church if people have questions. So
yeah, please feel free to come up to him, ask, engage in discussion. And man, it almost feels like I'm worried that I might have to take a test on this. But this was great for me, at least, and a lot of information. And I think some correlating stuff to get us to think about this, to see it, and to pick it out when we hear about it.
These are discussion starters. They help us have the conversation about schools and prisons and how, as communities and faith communities, we need to be looking at that.
Yeah.
So,
thank you, Gary. Let's thank you.